I mean, from there, like I said, you know, the department has always been a wonderful home, but it has not been, you know, what I always felt from the beginning, maybe. So, but I should mention that my interest in writing has increased considerably over the years, and it was very clear after the book on the wrestling stuff, my version of the catch. That I was going to end up writing pretty much full time eventually, in one fashion or another. But so I did later on in the late '80s. I did begin a book which I love. It's called One Hand Clapping. It's a novel. I wrote a novel that essentially is addressed, I mean, to both adults and to young adults. But it was published by a division of Douglas and McIntyre and Groundwood Books, which are very fine publishers, probably one of the best Canadian publishers at the time. So it got a lot of attention, and it's wonderful. It's a story of inspired by my son, my first son, who was disinclined to focus a great deal in school. Sure, it's not a problem it's unusual to any of us. I was very interested in, have always been very interested in Buddhism and in Zen Buddhism, and have practiced it, and have pretended that it does good things for my life. Maybe pretended is the proper word, maybe not, but I'm very committed to it. And so I came up with a story that would maybe teach my son a lesson. That was the idea. But I mean, it wasn't so much didactic as that. But it's the story of two brothers who don't get along, and the younger brother who feels set upon by his older brother joins his father in a retreat, a Zen Buddhist retreat in Japan. And because I had been going to Japan quite a bit at that time, I had good friends. I was able to set it partially in Canada and partially in Kamakura City, where there's a famous monastery, and so that the outcome was this book, which I've always been in love with. It's a very personal book, but it was very, very important to my life as an anthropologist, because I was able to explore Zen Buddhism and with my words, and teach at the same time through that, but by no means in a didactic fashion. And I realized that what was important to me about anthropology, and this has always been the case and will always be the case, it's the core of my interest in anthropology, is it's a vehicle or a mechanism through which it gives you an excuse to explore the worlds. And that's what this was. And I tried to do it to both my benefit and the benefit of my children. It's had quite a career. It's been through a couple of printings, and it was used in secondary schools in Ontario, and I get to go and give talks on it, as many of these young adult writers do. They make quite a living off of it, and but I don't. The idea was that I would write a couple of more of them, because once you write one of them and it's successful, then you're kind of expected to do a few more. You had a series. But I wasn't interested in that, but it was really a great thing for me, and I'm very grateful to Groundwood Press for taking it and for the help I had in kind of writing it. But I mean, the writing was really, by that time, by the late 80s and the early 90s, was really good writing was something I really cared about, and it always was part of my anthropology, in the sense that it was the vehicle through which I could explore the localities, the sites that anthropology was interested in. That was great. We can rejoin that because I started another book when this one was over, which I never finished for another 20 years. But I'd like to come back to that because it brings me back to Quebec anthropology and particularly to Marc Adelaar Tremblay and my relationship with him. So I don't want to forget about that. But I do think it's important to show the other divergence that arose out of my impatience with being in a pretty, pretty standard anthropology program. And I don't mean to be critical of Western. It was a great department. I was deeply committed to it, and still am. But I was simply by nature, by my own inclination, kind of a little bit too impatient for an academic life. Whoops, trying to find the right words here. But so what I did was I began to be. I had always been interested in the problems of development, and in particular, even with the work in Rwanda, I was very interested in the differences in occupations between the Tutsis and the Hutus, the Nilots and the Bantus, and the impact that had on their cultures and on their relationship. And on the inequality between them. That has always been, from Wittfogel to Oppenheimer to all those characters, it's always been a great subject, and that opened. But it's been very important to me, and Dumont, of course. And so I began in the mid-'80s as well to take an interest in development and in demography, and I wrote demography issues. I wrote about demography issues in Rwanda. And then I just simply decided to make the big break and to start a company and to begin doing consultancies. And I took on a really, really major project in the mid-'80s, which was financed by CETA and the Canadian and the Canadian government. Which was a study of a development project in northern Pakistan, where there was a need to remodel irrigation and to install drainage pipes because of the use of irrigation had been so careless. So it was going to be a multi-million-dollar project, many millions. And they wanted to have somebody do, the World Bank was executing it, and they wanted to have somebody to do a big study of it, essentially an agroeconomic study of the impact of this project. And it was going to last over a period of 10 years. So the idea was to do a baseline study and then a follow-up, an impact study. And so I bid on it. And to my enormous surprise and delight, I got the bid. I set it up and I created a team to do the baseline study, and away I go. And the project was huge. I mean, very few social science projects run into the 2 and 3 millions, and this was it. This was one of them, and so it was quite a departure. So I didn't teach during that time. I ran this project and spent a lot of time in Pakistan. And we wrote the baseline study, which I think was really very competent. And CETA was very pleased with it. And they asked us 7 years later once the project was over, to do an impact study. And we compared the economic data for previously, and I mean prior to the baseline, and after the project was over, and that's what produced this book. I know you like to. And the book didn't. I mean, it hasn't had a huge. I wanted to publish it in Pakistan, and not in Canada, because it took place. I mean, its concerns were Canadian. We're Pakistani. But it did have a significant impact, because what it showed was that if projects major economic growth investments or when you begin to toy with economic productive elements and you try to improve them, and you don't take into account discrepancies in income and discrepancies in access to resources, that it can backfire. And this spent, I think, almost $130 million and did not improve incomes hardly at all. Because there was growth, there was increase in income, there was dramatic improvements to the irrigation potential in this particular area, but much of the money was not invested in the local area. It was squandered by the very, very wealthy and invested overseas. So, I mean, many people talked about that in development, but nobody actually sat down and wrote over a period of 10 years a concrete case study. So it was a great thing to do. I must say it took 10 years, and I aged 30 in the course of it, but it was hard. But I became totally convinced that I should commit the rest of my intellectual career to trying to address what I had learned in development issues, and to commit myself to development issues, and when I could, at the point that I could, and to look directly at the problems of inequality, and the importance of inequalities and the considerations of the inequality factors in planning for development. So while on the one hand I had been moving toward creative writing, on the other hand, at the same time, I was really moving. I had really made a decision to develop a consulting firm, to use the consulting firm as a mechanism for taking contracts, to plan development wherever it was needed, and then it was a matter of just waiting until my kids were grown and I left Western. So that's what happened, and I never really left anthropology, because anthropology was really had been my life for so many years, from France all the way for 25 years at Western, 25 absolutely marvelous years at this university. But when I was 50, it was time to go, and so in 1998. I'll tell the story. Are we at the end of a segment? Well, I'll begin the story, because the work in Pakistan raised a number of issues that were not entirely associated with growth and with the necessary components of growth. And I don't think we have time to talk about them and what I've learned about that in the context of right now. But I do want to say that while I had been interested in Africa for so many years, now I was in South Asia, now particularly up in Peshawar, in northern Pakistan, and I was near Afghanistan, and the issues of Afghanistan were becoming very, very prominent, and I was very concerned about them, and so and particularly in the final phase of our work on this particular project. There were other projects in between, in and out of Pakistan and northern Pakistan, but this one in particular, we set up offices in Peshawar, and our offices were right next to the Taliban. And so we came to know the Taliban, and we saw what was happening, and this was 1992, and Omar was coming to power, and Afghanistan was falling apart, and I became very interested in that. There followed, among other things, a contract where I was, because I had learned to speak quite a bit of Pashtun, and they followed a very interesting contract for my new company to plan a way in which the removal of landmines, the many landmines that had been deposited by the Russians and the Americans and the Mujahideen, to find a way to remove them, and in a way that was culturally appropriate. And I did. And so they hired me and another guy from Australia and a couple other people. And I put together a team, and we did it for the UN. And so I found myself I mean, I'm not mentioning some of the other things, but this was really an important contract. And I found myself wandering through Afghanistan in the early years of the Taliban. And it was an extraordinary experience. The director of the UN program in Pakistan and Afghanistan at the time was an extraordinary man who eventually became an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. His name was Benon Sevan. And I don't expect anybody to know much about him, though he became very notorious because of something I'll come to later. But he was one of Kofi Annan's most trusted and really an extraordinary and charismatic man. He and I got to know each other in the course of this. He was based in Geneva, and I would go to give these talks. And he liked the work that we did. And I was very gratified because they changed the way they were doing, and landmine removal needed to change because it didn't make any sense. But with too much military, it really removing landmines, removing munitions that have been left behind. It's a social act. It has to be done, and you cannot afford to have militaries do it because militaries are too expensive. So I proposed that we get away with the military. Well, Benon Sevan loved this idea. And it did change a great deal the way landmine removal, which, as you know, came to great prominence in, was it 1997 with Lloyd Axworthy's famous landmine ban Ottawa Convention. So my involvement was very timely, I guess, and it did have a very interesting impact on the way in which the world, I guess, dealt with the tragedy of the dissemination of landmines. Well, Benon Sevan, when it was time for me to leave the university, when my kids were finally grown and I was ready to take off to get my wings going, Benon offered me a position at the United Nations as the analyst for a very difficult program, which was the program to provide, given the sanctions against Iraq, which had been implemented after the 1991 invasion by Saddam of Kuwait and responded to by Bush. And then when Saddam refused to obey Bush, they then imposed, the United Nations imposed these serious sanctions. And then, because the sanctions were so diabolical, the United Nations organized to buy the oil and to use all the oil that was produced by Iraq and then use oil to buy goods and to disseminate to the population. So I was in charge of reporting and for analyzing that thing. And it was a great and difficult job. But it gave me an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity, and I'm deeply humbled and grateful for that opportunity, to meet Kofi Annan and to meet people in the United Nations who really were trying to solve some very tough problems. And I was very committed. And so when I realized in 2001 that the Iraq program was doomed, we all knew it. It was sad because the Americans were so inimical to the program, would not let us do a thing. They blocked everything that we were trying to do. And Saddam and the Americans were getting into a fierce feud. It was clear they were going to end up, in full battle. I quit and decided to leave what they called then the Oil for Food program. But Kofi Annan and Benon Sevan asked if at that they were very confused about what to do. Everybody was confused about what to do at that juncture, what to do about Iraq. So they asked me if I would join what they called then the panels of experts. It was called a panel of experts, a panel d'experts on Iraq. And on that panel were some very prominent characters, the Prime Minister of Norway and stuff like that. And I was the scribe. And I was very delighted to be the scribe and to participate. I knew something about Iraq. I'd been going to Iraq every month for almost 2.5 years. And so we made a proposal to the Secretary General that he met with us. Kofi Annan is one of the great men of this generation, to remove sanctions. The Americans wouldn't let us, but we made the proposal anyway to the Security Council, and it went before the Security Council. It was strangely enough that the Americans did not veto it. In fact, the Russians vetoed it, and I learned then, to my great horror, that the Americans had agreed with the Russians not to speak out against Chechnya and all the things that the Russians were doing in Chechnya in exchange for the agreement that the Russians would veto our proposal to lift sanctions. One of the great lessons of my life. So we made the report. It was great to work at that level and to try to think through some of these difficult problems that involve both diplomacy and politics and growth. All of them were mixed up in this same time. And so I became kind of a guy who knew something about sanctions. And there weren't a lot of us in those days. There were a couple of Canadians who were very, very good at sanctions, but they were at a much higher level than I was. So when Kofi Annan was very concerned about what was going on in the Congo and was very interested in seeing if there wasn't something that could be done that involved imposing sanctions on some of the bad guys who were maintaining the rebels and the rebels' activities in the eastern Congo. Remember, this was 2002, 3, 4, when there had been a world war in the Congo for many, many years. He asked if I would join the panels of experts. And I should say something about panels of experts. They were a new invention, and on which many Canadians very proudly participated. But I think most prominently, let's mention Ian Smiley, who did all the work on diamonds and ended up creating the Kimberley process. What all really came out of his involvement with one of these panels of experts. So I was very honored, and it got me involved in once again in the Great Lakes region, of Africa, and particularly being concerned with the consequences of conflict and what one can do about them. So that changed my life, because after that was over, all those years in New York and stuff like that were over. Then when I came back to London, Ontario, I just decided to hang out my shingle as a consultant and see if I could make it without any institutional affiliation. And the idea was then to do contracts as I could get them and as they came along, and to work on my development stuff and on the insights that I had come to have on development issues, and on the one hand, and hopefully that would give me the time that I did not have when I was a professor. Hopefully that would give me enough time to write my books. I think it was an illusion, because the work as a development consultant, an international consultant, is harder than being a professor, much harder. And you have to make a living. And I still had kids in college, and you have to make a living. But I have to say that that was a marvelous segue to a career in anthropology, and anthropology was really invaluable, has been invaluable in the kinds of jobs that I've had to take up.